What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a simple morning interview, only to find himself disrespected on live television by a host who thinks he can say anything he wants? It only took 38 seconds of George Stephanopoulos making one completely out-of-line comment for the entire Good Morning America set to explode into absolute chaos, ending with security being called and Samuel L. Jackson walking off the show in front of millions of viewers. This was supposed to be a standard promotional appearance. Samuel L. Jackson, the legendary actor known for his powerful performances and no-nonsense attitude, was scheduled to discuss his latest film project on Good Morning America. The morning started normally enough. The crew was setting up, the cameras were rolling, and the Good Morning America panel was in position. George Stephanopoulos sat in the main host chair, flanked by Robin Roberts and Michael Strawn, both ready to contribute to what everyone assumed would be a pleasant conversation. Samuel walked onto the set with his usual confidence, greeting the panel with handshakes and smiles. The audience applauded warmly. He settled into the guest chair, adjusting his microphone as the production team gave their final cues. Robin Roberts smiled at him, welcoming him to the show with genuine warmth. Michael Strawn nodded in agreement, clearly happy to have such a distinguished guest on set. George Stephanopoulos opened the interview with what seemed like a standard question. "Samuel, thanks for being here this morning. Let's talk about your new film." Samuel leaned forward, ready to engage. "Absolutely, George. I'm excited to talk about this project. We've put a lot of work into it, and I think audiences are really going to connect with the story we're telling." But George didn't follow up on the film. Instead, he shifted gears completely. "Before we get into that, I want to ask you about something else. There's been a lot of talk about actors your age still taking on action roles. Don't you think there's a point where you should step aside for younger talent?" The question landed like a bomb. Robin Roberts' smile faltered. Michael Strawn shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Samuel's expression changed instantly, his eyes narrowing as he processed what had just been asked. "Excuse me?" Samuel said, his voice measured, but with an edge that anyone who knew him would recognize as a warning sign. George continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension he'd created. "I'm just saying, you're not getting any younger. Shouldn't roles like this go to actors who can actually handle the physical demands without, holding up production?" Robin Roberts jumped in quickly, trying to redirect. "George, I don't think that's... Samuel has been doing incredible work for decades, and..." But George cut her off. "Robin, I'm just asking what everyone's thinking. It's a legitimate question about the industry." Samuel sat back in his chair, his jaw tight. "What everyone's thinking. Or what you're thinking, George." "I'm thinking," George said, his tone becoming more confrontational, "that maybe it's time for some honest conversation about age in Hollywood. You've had a great run, but how much longer can you really keep this up?" Michael Strawn tried to intervene. "Hey, let's maybe talk about the actual film that Samuel's here to promote. That's why we..." George waved him off dismissively. "We'll get to that, Michael. I'm trying to have a real conversation here." Samuel's voice dropped lower, more intense. "A real conversation? You invite me on your show, and instead of talking about my work, you want to tell me I'm too old to do my job?" "I didn't say you were too old," George replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just questioning whether you're still the right fit for these kinds of roles." The studio had gone completely silent except for their voices. Camera operators stood frozen, unsure whether to keep filming. Production assistants watched in shock. Robin Roberts looked horrified, her hand hovering near her microphone as if debating whether to cut in again. Samuel leaned forward, his presence commanding the entire space. "George, let me explain something to you. I've been working in this industry since before you knew what a teleprompter was. I've earned every role I've ever taken. I've put in the work, the training, the dedication, and you're sitting there, behind your desk, questioning whether I can do my job." George's face flushed. "I'm a journalist. I ask tough questions. That's what I do." Tough questions? Samuel's voice rose slightly. There's a difference between tough questions and disrespectful questions, and you just crossed that line. Robin Roberts tried again. Samuel, we absolutely respect your work and everything you've accomplished. I think what we'd all love to hear about is... No, Robin, Samuel interrupted, but his tone with her was gentler. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but George here needs to understand something. He turned his full attention back to George. You don't get to sit there and diminish my career because you think it makes for good television. You don't get to question my abilities when you've never done what I do. You read off a teleprompter and interview people. I create characters. I bring stories to life. We are not the same. George's expression hardened. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, and yet you still don't know how to show basic respect, Samuel cut him off sharply. Interviewing someone doesn't make you better than them. It doesn't give you the right to talk down to your guests. Michael Strawn spoke up, his voice calm but firm. George, man, I think we need to reset here. This isn't the direction any of us expected this to go. But George wasn't backing down. I'm not going to apologize for asking questions that need to be asked. If Samuel can't handle a little criticism, maybe that proves my point about whether he's cut out for this anymore. The words hung in the air like poison. Robin Roberts gasped audibly. Michael Strawn's mouth dropped open in disbelief. Several crew members exchanged shocked glances. The atmosphere had gone from tense to toxic in an instant. Samuel stood up slowly, deliberately. He reached up and removed his microphone with careful precision, the small clip making a loud sound in the silent studio. Every movement was controlled, purposeful. This wasn't a man losing his temper. This was a man making a choice. "What are you doing?" George asked, a hint of concern finally creeping into his voice. Samuel looked down at him, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disgust. I'm making a choice not to sit here and be insulted by someone who clearly doesn't understand the first thing about professionalism or respect. You're walking out, George said, and now he sounded almost panicked. In the middle of an interview? There is no interview, George. An interview requires two people having a conversation. What you're doing is trying to tear someone down on live television to make yourself look important. Samuel placed the microphone on the chair where he'd been sitting. I don't need this. I don't need your show. And I certainly don't need to justify my career to you. Robin Roberts stood up, reaching out. Samuel, please, we can continue this conversation differently. I'd love to hear about your film, about your process. Samuel's expression softened when he looked at her. Robin, you've always been professional and kind. I respect you. And Michael, same to you. But I'm not staying on a set where the lead host thinks it's acceptable to treat guests this way. This is ridiculous, George sputtered. You can't just leave because I asked you a difficult question. Samuel turned back to him one last time. George, if you think what you did here was journalism, you need to go back to school. Journalism is about seeking truth and understanding. What you did was try to make yourself feel superior by putting someone else down. That's not journalism. That's ego. Michael Strawn stood as well. Samuel, for what it's worth, man, I think you handled this with more grace than it deserved. I appreciate that, Michael. Samuel looked around the studio, at the crew members who'd been watching the entire exchange. To everyone else here who does their jobs with actual professionalism, thank you. You didn't deserve to be part of this circus. George was on his feet now, too, his face red. You think you can just walk onto my show and insult me? Your show? Samuel's eyebrows rose. This is Good Morning America, George. It's not your personal platform to attack people. And I didn't insult you. I responded to your insults with honesty. A producer rushed onto the set, speaking urgently into a headset, clearly trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Other staff members were moving now, some trying to salvage the segment, others simply watching the confrontation unfold. Robin Roberts attempted one more time to de-escalate. "Gentlemen, we're live. Millions of people are watching. Can we please just take a breath and—" "Robin, they should be watching," Samuel said firmly. "They should see what happens when someone uses their position to try to humiliate a guest. They should see that it's not acceptable." George pointed at Samuel, his hand shaking slightly with anger or adrenaline. "You're making a huge mistake. Walking off this show. Burning this bridge." "The only mistake," Samuel interrupted, his voice cutting and clear, "was thinking that coming here would be a positive experience. You made sure it wasn't." He started walking toward the exit of the studio. Camera operators didn't know whether to follow him or stay focused on the panel. The whole production was in chaos. Robert sat back down heavily, looking devastated. Michael Strawn stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head slowly. George called after him, "You're being unprofessional." Samuel stopped and turned around one final time, his voice carrying across the entire studio. "Unprofessional is inviting someone onto your show under the pretense of promoting their work, then ambushing them with insulting questions designed to make them look bad. Unprofessional is doubling down when you're called out instead of acknowledging you were wrong. Unprofessional is putting your ego above your responsibility to your audience and your guests." "Get out then," George shouted, losing his composure completely. "We don't need you here. Clearly, I don't need to be here either." Samuel's voice was calm again, which somehow made his words more powerful. "Good luck with the rest of your show, George. I hope you figure out the difference between being a tough interviewer and being disrespectful. There is one." Robin Roberts spoke quietly, but her voice was picked up by her microphone. "Samuel, I'm so sorry this happened." He nodded to her. "Not your fault, Robin. You tried to keep this civil." He glanced at Michael. "Both of you did." As Samuel walked toward the studio doors, a production assistant scrambled to open them for him. George remained standing at the desk, his chest heaving, clearly trying to regain control of the situation and the show. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of the disaster. Michael Strawn leaned toward George and said something off microphone, but his body language made it clear he wasn't happy. Robin Roberts had her head in her hands briefly before composing herself and trying to figure out how to transition to the next segment. George turned to the camera, attempting to address the audience. "Well, we'll take a commercial break and—" But before he could finish, Samuel's voice carried from near the exit. "And for anyone watching at home who wants to see my film, it opens nationwide next weekend. I'm proud of the work we did. Come check it out." Even in his exit, he managed to accomplish what he'd come there to do, promote his project, just without giving George the satisfaction of being part of it. The studio doors closed behind Samuel L. Jackson with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the entire space. George slumped back into his chair as producers rushed the desk, everyone talking at once. Robin Roberts looked directly at the camera with an expression that suggested she wanted to be anywhere else. Michael Strawn simply sat down and waited for someone to tell him what was supposed to happen next. The commercial break countdown began, but the damage was done. The entire confrontation had played out live, unfiltered, in front of millions of morning television viewers who tuned in expecting celebrity small talk and movie promotion. Instead, they'd witnessed a complete breakdown of a standard interview format, all because one host decided to prioritize controversy over courtesy. In those final seconds before the show cut to commercial, George looked at his co-hosts. Michael wouldn't meet his eyes. Robin shook her head slowly, disappointment written across her face. The crew members who'd witnessed everything moved about their duties mechanically, professional enough to keep doing their jobs even as they processed what they'd just seen. George picked up his notes, shuffled them unnecessarily, and cleared his throat. We'll continue after this break." But everyone in that studio knew that nothing was going to continue normally. A guest had just walked off Good Morning America in the middle of a live interview, calling out the host for disrespect on national television. Samuel L. Jackson, one of the most respected figures in Hollywood, had drawn a line and walked away rather than tolerate being treated poorly. The red light on the camera finally went. Dark, signaling the commercial break had begun. The moment it did, the studio erupted in hushed but urgent conversations. Producers surrounded George, clearly needing to discuss what had just happened and how to address it when they came back from commercial. Robin Roberts removed her earpiece and stood up, walking off the set without a word to George. Michael Strawn followed her, leaving George alone at the desk with increasingly frantic production staff. Security personnel who'd been stationed near the exits returned to their normal positions, though they'd moved toward the set when tensions escalated, ready to intervene if the confrontation had become physical. Thankfully, Samuel had kept his composure throughout, even as George had lost his. The commercial break ticked away, and somewhere in the building, Samuel L. Jackson was leaving through a back exit, probably calling his publicist to explain what had happened, though the publicist had likely watched it live along with everyone else. His dignity intact, his point made, his film still promoted despite George's attempt to derail the interview. Back on the set, makeup artists approached George to touch up his appearance before the cameras went live again. He waved them off irritably. A senior producer leaned in close, speaking directly into his ear, probably explaining exactly how they were going to address what had happened when they returned from commercial. Robin Roberts and Michael Strawn returned to the set, both visibly unhappy but professional enough to continue with the show. They took their seats, adjusted their microphones, and waited for the countdown. Neither spoke to George during those final moments before going back live. The floor director began counting down from 10. George straightened his papers again, took a sip of water, and tried to arrange his face into something resembling composure. Robin and Michael looked at each other briefly, a silent communication passing between them that spoke volumes about their feelings regarding what had just transpired. The red light came back on. They were live again, and George Stephanopoulos had to face the camera, and millions of viewers knowing that they'd all just watched him get called out by Samuel L. Jackson for disrespectful behavior, and that the legendary actor had chosen to walk away rather than continue the conversation. The fallout from those 38 seconds, when George made his first dismissive comment about age, would reverberate far beyond that morning's broadcast. But in that moment, as the show continued, the message was clear. Samuel L. Jackson had stood up for himself, refused to accept disrespectful treatment, and walked away with his head held high, while George Stephanopoulos was left to deal with the consequences of his actions in front of a live national audience.